Joining me now, John Hart, former communications director for Senator Tom Coburn, CNN political commentator Karen Finney, national security attorney Bradley Moss, and Republican strategist Rena Shaw. You know, it's true. Many people have been looking at this and thinking, well, how many others are going to fall in line? Is this the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning as it comes to the worries surrounding this issue? What do you think?
I was on the Hill with two members of Congress in 2008, 2009, and this is tough, but it's nothing like that time. So we do need to remember that and keep that in perspective. But I think pulling back here, what I see to be hugely problematic is the fact that there's such a lack of competition between these big banks. And when you look at what's to come, it's looking at other banks that are part of the top 20 biggest banks in this country and seeing how they act, just like SVB. SVB was trying to act like a regional bank, yet it had these big, overblown expectations and plans for itself. So what happened here, I think, is less about culture and the very fact that these big banks behave recklessly, their executives behave recklessly, and they don't believe that the regulators can do anything to them. Because another thing that's funny, former Congressman Barney Frank now sits on the board of a very large bank. So the regulators are not going to be regulating for very long because they're going to join them. I think there's a really serious concern about how you move forward when there are going to be deleterious effects on housing. You know, we need to talk about getting more liquidity into the mortgage market. I think that could be a good fix to begin with.
It's going to be interesting to see next week. You know, we're supposed to, the Fed is supposed to raise interest rates. Do they continue? We're talking about how the raising of interest rates, in addition to the Fed not so much doing its job with regard to
You know. There's SVB and there's SBF, and we're totally different.
But you know, I mean, I think there's a real question: do they raise it as much as folks have been anticipating, and does that settle the market? If they don't do that much, does that create panic or concern, particularly given what we saw with Credit Suisse and the other concerns with other banks, and sort of everybody trying to say nothing to see here, it's all calm? How does the Fed play into that?
It'll be interesting to see, you know, we've just got this report just before we're coming on from ABC News that there were some SVB execs who apparently were dumping stock in the days leading up to the collapse. How much of the investigation, both the Justice Department but also Congress, will look into the extent to which some of these executives, kind of going to your point, more or less abuse their power and abuse the system when there was a gap in regulatory oversight and did it to their own personal benefit? We saw that in 2008, and almost nothing happened to any of those individuals. They got great, you know, golden parachutes. They went off and did something else without any shame or accountability. Will we see that again? Because remember, there were a lot of political implications that came out of how that crisis was handled. Both on the left, you think of Occupy Wall Street, and on the right, you had the Tea Party. And those were the outgrowth of the 2008 crash. Are we going to see that again?
A good point, especially, and again, on the idea of the dumping of stocks, there are instances where it's not nefarious, and part of the investigation is going to be a part of that. But it's a really strong point to think about what this new frontier looks like. The idea of if this happened, if the sort of the post-mortem has been so easy to dissect and think about what happened, then deterrence maybe should have been more readily available and easier.
Right. Well, I was also on the Hill during 2007, 2008.
Who wasn't on the Hill? Show of hands here.
A lot of people. Yeah.
I was a young lawyer. It was easier times.
The reason these banks acted recklessly is because they were incentivized to act that way. Yes. They knew that they would be bailed out. And, you know, the problem in Washington is that when there's no loser, everybody loses in the economy. And we have too many people in D.C. who believe in tooth fairy economics, that if you lose something, money just magically shows up under your pillow and everything's okay.
That's the name of your next book. That's the one.
Yeah. But it really gets down to this question of what is your theory of wealth creation? Is wealth the measure of what people value and will pay for things that are important to them, goods and services, or is wealth defined by whatever government says it is, whatever government decides to print that year? And whenever we get away from wealth creation being anything other than what people value, we set ourselves on a very dangerous path, whether it's ESG and you know, the bank SVB, whatever it's called. They had an A rating for ESG. Well, that didn't help them very much. And I'm all for conservation, but I'm also all for wealth creation, that if you are creating wealth, then you're adding something. Then you have the foundation and the platform to talk about other things. But if you're not, and it's really, and what they did is they didn't manage risk well. That's the simple
Well, we have to look at why that was. We have to say, what did the regulators fail to do? And I don't care whether they were working remotely, cared about social justice issues or not. You still have a job that you're supposed to be doing, managing that wealth. Managing risk. And number three, as much as many of my Democrats don't want to talk about it, lightening up some of those restrictions in 2018, it appears, actually may have played a role. They should just be able to say, we made a mistake. I'm going to make one prediction of a phrase that is going to come back into the lexicon. It's old and new again, clawback. We are going to be talking about, because in addition to what you were saying about dumping stocks, they had enough money to give themselves some nice $1 million bonuses just as everything was going down the drain. So I do think we're going to hear about
I think this is a really great time, though, to talk about and have a really realistic and reasoned conversation about decentralized finance. And I know some people get really nervous, but I like cryptocurrency. I think it's important to talk about I really do. And I think, you have people on the Hill who are really big enemies of this. Senator Elizabeth Warren being one of those people. But we need to talk about things like Bitcoin being, just not being able to withstand the pressures of inflation. I mean, this is a real conversation. Americans are thinking about the future of finance and these big banks being able to control everything and then having such deleterious effects on our everyday lives. And then again, bringing it all back to other things like housing, the housing shortage and the fact that we no longer talk about, are we an ownership society or are we a society that's just going to rent forever? And then talking to millennials about that as well.
Well, two things. One, Signature Bank, right, is known for its connection with cryptocurrency. It's one of the banks that had the failures in the last week. So I do wonder what the long-term effects of that. But I do wonder about, our conversation became very esoteric and not so much about the minutia of this particular problem, which I think is exactly what might happen on the Hill. And the idea of if we are to broaden it in the way we're talking about, is that going to be a good or bad thing to actually solving the problem? Or will it become a conversation about how we view and value money more broadly?
Well, I say, is that a problem that can be solved? You said, is it all about just wealth creation? But what's the old saying? Money makes the world go round. That's what builds up modern economies. It's the foundation of everything we have now. Is there a true institutional, is there a political solution to that? Or does this go to a larger cultural problem on how we value money and how we assess risk? Is that something that can be legislatively fixed? Or is that a cultural problem that isn't easily addressed through politics?
Well, certainly one of the ways to address it, and this is something the president called for, asked Congress to do today, which is to give the power to get the money back from those executives, that there should be more accountability among the executives and those who were in charge of managing that risk and who failed to do their jobs.
Well, her bracket will be clawbacks, everyone. That's the March Madness, political brackets we've got right now. So everyone stick around.